Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a bedtime story that isn't gentle at all. It's jagged, thunderous, and soaked in fear. This is Greek mythology the way it was lived, not the polished version in coffee table books. Think less shining statues, more sleepless nights under a god who ruled like the worst boss imaginable, unpredictable, paranoid, and endlessly hungry for control. Zeus wasn't just the king of the gods. He was the kind of leader who would overthrow his own father, then spend eternity terrified that his children would do the same to him. He kidnapped queens, disguised himself as animals, and even pulled mortal boys up to Olympus just to keep them at his side. Each thunderbolt wasn't a symbol of glory, it was HR paperwork written in lightning, a reminder that no one, not even his family, was safe. And yet, we still whisper his name like a bedtime mantra, as if saying Zeus will help us drift off instead of keeping us up. But maybe that's why these myths endure, because in their chaos, in their cruelty, they mirror the parts of human power we still wrestle with today. The fear of being crushed by someone stronger, the dread of injustice that never gets punished, the uneasy comfort of knowing even gods are ruled by insecurity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He didn't enter the world holding thunder. He entered it ducking it. Kronos had heard a prophecy one of his children would topple him, so he solved it the way a bad boss solves a hard conversation. He swallowed it. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. 5 little lives filed away like emails he didn't want to read. Rhea, their mother, stood by with a smile that wasn't a smile and hands that shook after every birth. You don't forget the sound a room makes when a baby goes quiet too soon. By the time she carried Zeus, Rhea was finished being quiet. She slipped away to Crete, to a cave that smelled of wet stone and wild honey, and delivered her son where thunder couldn't find him. The Curette's young warriors kept watch, clashing bronze to drown his cries. Nymphs passed him warm milk and stories. The goat Amalthea nuzzled him like a furnace in winter. Not exactly a royal nursery, but it worked. Survival rarely looks photogenic. Mini Hook. Imagine your first lullaby as a drumline meant to fool a monster. Growing up like that edits your wiring. Zeus learned the 2 rules of every unsafe household: hide well and hit first. Trust is hard to practice when the first man who loved you turned your siblings into a snack. When the boy became tall enough to shadow a doorway, the hiding ended. Zeus came home to his father's hall without a trumpet. Just a task. With Metis, the sharp-eyed titaness who understood that brains beat jaws, he brewed an emetic as polite as poison gets. Kronos took the cup. Maybe he thought it was a toast. Maybe he thought he had already won for the last time. Either way, the king of the old gods bent, choked, and emptied his stomach like a busted storm drain. Out came Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Not infants, not any more grown. Furious, slick with the past. Family reunion, ancient Greek edition. No hugs, no cake, just 5 people who knew exactly what the inside of their father felt like. Here's the part the marble statues don't tell. It wasn't pure heroics. It was logistics. Metis calculated, Zeus executed. Rhea covered the exits. The Curettes banged their shields again, only this time to warn the world that something old had ended. What began wasn't peace, it was planning. Zeus held his siblings' eyes and said the obvious, this can't happen again, but under the voice was a burn, we'll keep seeing the fear of being next. The prophecy he grew up under didn't vanish when Kronos gagged. It crawled into Zeus's pocket and moved in. So, no, he didn't grab lightning and call it a day. He started with lists, allies, weapons, terrain, who owed whom favors, who would swivel when the room tilted. He learned power moves quietly before it thunders. Mini Hook in every tyrant story. The childhood lesson becomes the lever they pull forever. Rhea kissed Zeus's forehead like she was both blessing him and letting him go. She had outsmarted a god, but she couldn't parent the war that was coming. The children of Kronos walked out of that hall carrying 3 things each other, a debt and a map. You can call this the birth of a hero if you want. It isn't wrong, it just isn't complete. He was a rescuer, yes, but also a son studying a cruel blueprint. When someone solves a problem by swallowing it, the next generation learns not to argue with problems, they learn to end them. Zeus looked up at the sky and measured the distance between fear and control. It looked like one storm. He would raise an army from caves and coastlines. He would ask old enemies to be new friends. He would move the quiet way first, then the loud way later. And when it got loud, it would be the kind of loud that makes mountains remember. Before any of that, Rhea still had one last performance to give. She wrapped a stone in soft cloth, kissed it like a real child, and laid it in Kronos' hands. He didn't even look. He tipped his head back and gulped the bundle whole. Somewhere a cave exhaled. Somewhere a mother stopped shaking for now. That's the moment the future cracked. Thunder was coming. Not because he loved it, because he had learned to live where it never stopped. And here's where the Air Titans' talk is done. The siblings will need allies older than memory. The Cyclopes with their forge-bright eyes, and the 100-handed who can turn a field into a storm of fists. The ground itself will take sides. Oceans will listen. The sky will keep score. Call it rebellion if you want. In their mouths it will taste like justice. In Kronos's, it will taste like metal. The stone had barely settled in Kronos's gut when the air around Olympus shifted. A silence like the pause before a fight. Zeus had cracked the door, but now he had to kick it wide open. The old order wasn't going to roll over. Kronos still sat on the throne, and the Titans, his brothers and sisters, had no intention of letting children run the cosmos. Mini-Hook imagine a war where your generals are siblings you just rescued from digestive hell, and your enemies are your aunts and uncles, each the size of a mountain. Family therapy doesn't cover this. Zeus didn't win hearts with charm, he bartered survival. The Cyclopes, imprisoned deep in Tartarus, were dragged into daylight. Their hands hammered lightning, tridents, and helmets that made the night itself obey. The 100-handed, those giant beings with 50 heads and 100 arms, had been chained for so long their voices rattled like boulders. Zeus cut the locks, and the earth quaked with their gratitude. These weren't symbols, they were weapons proof that when gods want change, they don't start petitions. The first battles cracked valleys into continents. Titans hurled mountains. The Olympians hurled storms. Poseidon smashed oceans into walls of water. Hades dragged shadows into spears. Zeus stood at the center, hurling bolts that carved daylight into midnight skies. Every strike was a reminder Kronos' paranoia had made him powerful. But Zeus's paranoia made him ruthless. The war stretched 10 years, long enough for forests to die under the weight of thrown peaks, long enough for rivers to run red with myths that no bard could pretty up. Mortals looked up at the flashing sky and thought the world itself was sick. They weren't wrong. Mini-Hook. You know a conflict is bad when people start rooting for earthquakes to pick a side. In the final clash, Zeus met Kronos in the open, thunder to sickle, no speeches, just raw fear and rage passed down like inheritance. Kronos swung to cut the prophecy from Zeus's throat, but his children caught his arms, each one holding down the father who'd once held them captive inside himself. And Zeus, eyes burning with the same terror that raised him in caves, hurled a bolt that split the old king's crown in half. Kronos fell, not in glory but in silence. The Titans were chained and buried under Tartarus, where no light could find them. Olympus was now the seat of a new regime. But don't mistake this for liberation. Zeus hadn't built freedom, he'd built a sharper cage. Because when you overthrow a tyrant by force, you inherit not only his throne but his fear. And Zeus carried that fear like a shield. He would never let go of it. The ash settled, and the mountain winds carried the heat away. There was a quiet sounding like relief. The next fight wasn't fists or lightning. It was paperwork who owns what, who answers to whom, and who pretends the answers were fair. They met where cloud becomes cliff. Themis stood with a face like law. The fates watched. The Cyclops hauled in 3 weapons, a thunderbolt that hummed, a trident that salted the air, and a helmet that swallowed the wearer whole. The 100-handed waited in the distance, newly unchained, appointed as jailers for whatever needed burying. Zeus said they would draw lots. No blood. He said, no more. It sounded gentle. But even kindness feels sharp from a man who throws daylight like knives. Poseidon rolled the idea like a pebble. Hades said nothing. 3 lots, 3 realms, sky, Sea. Underworld. The earth would remain common, a shared floor no one could sell. They swore on the Styx because that's the oath nothing survives breaking. The river hissed like a fuse. Zeus drew the sky the coin toss that controls weather, harvests, travel. Poseidon opened his hand to the sea, a restless kingdom good for smashing, bad for sleeping. Hades took the helm and the depth where all debts end. Call it random, or call it design with a smile. Either way, the universe left labelled and locked. You can tell when a democracy is cosplay. The winner walks out with the gavel and the lightning. On Olympus, the carpenters were wind and time. Hermes traced routes across air. Hestia built the hearth. Hera measured the room from the throne. It looked like order. It felt like a truce with crossed fingers. Poseidon didn't bow. He bargained. The sea answers only to itself, and he who shakes the earth when he's angry wouldn't ask permission to make a point. Zeus didn't ask him to. He let clouds pile up until the room dimmed and reminded everyone that ships, cities, and crops listen to the sky first. Hades kept to the edges. He visited rarely. The way a surgeon attends a party, polite, late, thinking about work no one wants to discuss. His realm needed rules. No trumpets, no banners, just a ferry, a gate, and a dog who wouldn't forget a face. Hermes would collect. Down there, no coups, just accounting. Zeus understood optics. He declared assembly days. But the real decisions moved on quieter roads. Iris with messages like rain. Hermes trading favours in the shade of columns. Eagles drawing circles where Zeus wanted eyes. When a ruler is still afraid, he doesn't loosen his grip. He builds systems that look like open hands and feel like cages. He also wrote the first employee manual you actually read aloud. Swear by the Styx or don't swear at all. Don't steal fire you can't pay for. Don't make oaths you plan to wiggle out of. Everyone nodded. Everyone had a reason to ignore it later. Zeus kept the thunder close to remind them what happened when they did. Freedom gets mentioned most in rooms where it isn't. Disputes arrived like weather. A river god redirected a stream and drowned a valley. Farmers prayed. Poseidon said the river was a cousin and would not be leashed. Zeus walked the rain over another ridge. A city promised a festival and forgot to pay. Hades sent a rumour of fevers, and the city remembered. Olympus didn't need prisons up here. Punishment travelled farther when it looked like nature. Earth was the old argument. Who owned the air above a city who spoke for harbours, mines, temples that wanted new roofs, Zeus called the Earth Common, then sat at the highest point on it. Shared property with a landlord. Some days felt like peace. On those days the new order looked like a victory. On other days Zeus went quiet and followed a line in his memory back to a cave where a boy learned noise could hide a life. He never forgot that lesson. He never let noise belong to anyone else. The Titans didn't disappear. They became a map edge that said, "Here there be chains." The 100-handed stood over Tartarus like living walls. When the ground trembled, mortals called it an omen. The gods called it maintenance. Poseidon checked the trident's teeth the way a man checks the edge of a story. He and Zeus could sit without speaking, two storms comparing notes. Hades joined sometimes and looked past the horizon as if it were a ledge over his thoughts. They were brothers because the world said so. That's a kind of bond. It just isn't love. There was talk of patronage, of cities choosing guardians and guardians choosing sides. Athena watched from the shadows of a half-built hall and kept count of every boast. She liked rules when they were clean. Olympus rarely was. She would learn to play anyway. On paper the division worked. In practice it worked because most people were tired. After 10 years of mountains thrown like javelins, routine felt holy. Zeus leaned into that. He made schedule a god. He made predictability feel like mercy. And when mercy failed, he made an example. A minor god broke an oath and laughed. The laugh didn't last. Thunder rolled in without a storm, under the table. No speech, no debate. Just a flash bright enough to leave everyone blinking. Quiet enough to make them hear their hearts. The god lived. He didn't forget. Neither did the rest. Hades sent a letter in ash. The ledger stands. Poseidon slid a pale shell onto the table and said nothing. Zeus nodded. That was a vote. That was how votes worked here now. Call it stability if you want. It was also a jaw closing around a new bite. The world was divided, counted, signed for. Storms knew their roots. Rivers knew their depth. The dead knew the way. The living learned when to look up, and in the quiet rooms behind the bright halls, Zeus kept measuring distances between oath and action, between brother and rival, between love and leverage. He had won the sky, but what he wanted to own was certainty. The problem with certainty is that it never stops eating. Some nights, when the moon made Olympus look like memory, he stood alone on the high terrace and listened for a sound that wasn't there, the clatter of shields, goats in the dark, a mother's breath finally steady. He counted city lights like candles. Peace looked like a held breath. It would hold, he decided, as long as he held it. The throne gleamed, the council chambers filled, and the air above Olympus carried the smell of stone after rain. Zeus had carved up the world with his brothers, and the order looked steady. But stability breeds appetite. When the sky feels too small, you look down. And Zeus looked down a lot. Minihook, the king of gods, could hold back storms, but he couldn't hold back himself. Europa was the first name whispered. She walked by the sea, princess of Phoenicia, her hands brushing the tide like it was silk. Zeus saw her, and, like always, wanted her. Not as a queen, not as an equal, simply wanted. He bent himself into a bull, white as foam, eyes soft enough to pass for harmless. Europa climbed onto his back with a laugh, and in a heartbeat the bull lunged into the waves. She screamed, salt water in her mouth, her kingdom shrinking behind her. He carried her across the sea to Crete, where she bore children she hadn't asked for. To mortals, it became romance. To Europa, it was exile with a crown. Then came Leda, night on the riverbank, a swan, trembling, wings heavy with false innocence. Leda stretched out her arms and caught it against her chest. The weight was a lie. The swan was Zeus, slick feathers masking the hunger of a king. From her body came eggs that hatched Helen, Clytemnestra, and the twin boys who would bleed into history. Poets painted it as destiny. But picture the queen's eyes in that moment, surprise calcified into silence. Io, priestess of Hera, stood in temple smoke when Zeus cornered her. To hide her from his wife, he transformed her into a cow, not spared, just disguised. Hera saw the trick, tied Io to a tormentor, set a gadfly to drive her insane across the continents. Each step she took, chased by stings and shame, was less myth than survival story. Callisto was next, a huntress sworn to Artemis, proud in the wilderness until Zeus came cloaked in Artemis's form. She reached for a friend's embrace and found violation instead, cast out, cursed, and finally turned into a bear. Callisto lived only to be hunted by her own son. The stars above still trace her shape, but constellations don't warm you when the night remembers. This pattern wasn't a series of romances, it was policy. Zeus didn't just rule with thunder, he ruled with access, with masks, with force. The sky obeyed him, but he needed mortals and nymphs to break so he could remind himself he was whole. Minihook thunder makes noise, but power whispers in disguises. The council never spoke of these nights. Hera raged, broke temples, punished the women instead of the man. The gods looked away, muttering about fate and beauty. Mortals wrote hymns and called it love, because the truth was too dangerous to sing. But look closer, every so-called conquest left a scar on the world. Europa's name stamped onto a continent, Leda's children splitting empires, Io wandering until Egypt bore her mark, Callisto frozen above us in eternal reminder. Each victim carried Zeus's fear forward, and fear has a way of outlasting thunder. It wasn't lust alone, it was paranoia turned inward. Zeus had beaten Kronos, but the prophecy still coiled in his chest his children would one day dethrone him. Every new union, every child, was both desire and defense. Breed enough heirs and maybe one would save him, or maybe one would kill him. Either way, the dice never stopped rolling. And if you're wondering where justice sat during all this, it sat in silence. Olympus was the kind of office where HR reports vanish, and everyone learns to laugh too loudly at the boss's jokes. Down below, mortals whispered the stories as warnings. Up above, Zeus counted his offspring and called it destiny. Not every abduction came dressed as a swan or a bull. Sometimes it was simpler, no costume, no mask, just the blunt act of taking. Ganymede was proof. He wasn't a queen or a priestess or a nymph hidden in the woods. He was a boy, a Trojan prince, with hair like bronze catching the sun and hands that poured wine smoother than any vintage. The songs said he was beautiful, but beauty isn't a shield. It's bait when the sky itself is watching. Zeus saw him once, standing on the plain with a cup lifted, and that was enough. An eagle ripped down from Olympus, talons sharp, wings blotting out the light. Mortals hit the ground in terror. Ganymede didn't even have time to scream before he was carried into the clouds. One heartbeat he was a sun, the next he was gone, the horizon blank where he'd stood. Mini-hook. Imagine being so good at pouring wine your boss kidnaps you to never clock out again. On Olympus, they gave him a title cupbearer of the gods. He poured nectar at banquets, standing beside Zeus's throne, a boy in the middle of immortal laughter. They dressed it up like an honor. Mortals wrote it like a fairy tale. But in the pauses, when the goblets were empty, what did Ganymede feel? The mountain winds were cold. His parents were dusting an empty seat at their table. Every story about him from then on wasn't his, it was Zeus's. Hera hated him, but not for being stolen, she hated him for being kept. Another reminder that Zeus's appetite never stopped, not even at her side. The gods teased, the poets glossed, but Trojan mothers whispered Ganymede's name like a prayer against the sky. Zeus, in his pride, tried to make it right. He gifted the boy's family a team of immortal horses, the kind that never tire, never stumble, as if animals could fill the absence of a child, as if grief could be traded like livestock. In Troy, the horses were treasured. At the hearth, the chair stayed empty. The twist here is simple. Ganymede didn't just become Zeus's servant. He became a symbol. His figure rose into the stars, stitched into the constellation Aquarius, a jug tilted forever. The Greeks looked up and said it was beauty rewarded. But every time those stars poured light into the night, another voice whispered, it was beauty stolen. This wasn't a romance. It was possession. And possession leaves no room for choice. Zeus didn't mind the contradiction. To him, Ganymede was proof of power, a boy plucked from kings and set higher than them all, yet never free. Each banquet cup was another reminder that no distance, no crown, no mortal bond could keep anyone safe when the sky wanted them. Mini-hook thunder may frighten villages, but it was the eagle that taught them to look up in fear. Semele's story begins with a whisper and ends in fire. She was no queen, no huntress, just a mortal princess of Thebes who caught Zeus's eye. That was enough. He came to her in secret, cloaked in shadows, speaking like a man who promised the world and meant it. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? When the king of gods bends low and calls you beloved, doubt feels like blasphemy. But Hera, patient and venomous, knew the pattern. She slid into the story disguised as an old woman. She sat beside Semele, hand on her knee, and asked the kind of question that eats trust alive. If Zeus truly loves you, why hasn't he shown himself as he really is? It sounded like concern. It was poison dressed as advice. Semele listened. And once a seed like that is planted, it grows. The next time Zeus visited, she asked. Not for gifts, not for immortality, just truth. She wanted to see him as he truly was. Zeus had sworn on the river Styx to grant whatever she wished. He tried to stall, tried to beg her back into safety. But a Styx oath is iron. Break it, and even gods unravel. Mini-hook. Imagine loving someone so much that the truth itself kills you. Zeus revealed himself lightning, storm, the full blaze of Olympus. The air tore open. Fire ate the chamber walls. Semele's human body cracked under it. In a flash, she was gone, burned not by malice but by proximity. She was pregnant when she died. Zeus reached into the flames and pulled out the unborn child. He stitched the fetus into his own thigh, carrying it like a secret wound. Months later, from that scar, Dionysus was born god of wine, theatre, and madness, the son of a mother who never got to hold him. The irony stings. Mortals sing of Dionysus as joy, ecstasy, release, but his origin is grief. His first cry was a mother's silence. Every vineyard, every stage, every drunken hymn owes itself to a woman erased because she asked for honesty. Zeus told himself it was fate, that he gave her immortality through her son, that the world gained more than it lost. But each time Dionysus stumbled through the halls of Olympus, wild-eyed and laughing, the gods glanced at Zeus's leg, and they remembered what it had cost. This wasn't a love story. It was a cautionary tale. Trust a god, and you may get a miracle, or you may get fire. Mini-hook thunder can kill from above, but sometimes the deadliest bolt is the truth you beg to see. Metis was the kind of woman who made even gods uneasy. A titaness, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded. She was known not for beauty alone, but for counsel. When the war against Kronos had hung in the balance, Zeus leaned on her wisdom. She was his partner, his ally, the whisper in the dark that gave him victory. But prophecy doesn't care about loyalty. The fates warned the child of Metis would surpass its father, and the second would end Zeus's reign. To most men, that's paranoia fuel. To Zeus, it was confirmation of the lesson carved into him as a child power is always waiting to be stolen. Mini-hook, if your therapist tells you your kid will overthrow you, maybe rethink the parenting plan. He didn't rethink, he hunted. He visited Métis in the quiet of the earth, spoke to her with the voice of the man she had built up, and when her guard lowered, he swallowed her whole. Not figuratively, not as a metaphor, he devoured her. The titaness who gave him strategy became a ghost in his gut. Olympus called it clever. The poets painted it as survival. But it was fear, nothing more, inside him. Metis lived on, pregnant, restless, crafting armor for the daughter who grew in secret. Zeus walked Olympus with a smile plastered over a headache that clawed deeper each day. The pounding grew unbearable, the sound of hammers on an anvil echoing behind his eyes. One day, unable to endure, he called for Hephaestus. The smith god lifted his axe and split Zeus's skull like a log. From the wound leapt Athena fully grown, armoured, radiant, the goddess of war and wisdom, born not of love, but of paranoia. The crowd cheered. They praised Zeus for birthing wisdom itself. They called him father of strategy. They forgot the woman still trapped inside him. Metis was erased. No throne, no temple, no stories sung in her honour. Athena walked the marble halls, brilliant and free, but her mother remained a silence in Zeus's belly. That's the cruelty no hymn admits even when a woman consents, creates, contributes. She is still disposable when prophecy says so. Mini-hook the gods may shine on Olympus, but the brightest light always casts the darkest erasures. Zeus convinced himself he'd solved the problem. No son had been born, only a daughter. He laughed at the prophecy, laughed at the fates, paraded Athena as proof of his triumph. But fear doesn't die just because you feed it a loophole. It lingers. Every time he looked at Athena disciplined, cunning, unshakable, he wondered would she be the one not by prophecy, but by choice. That's the irony. In trying to prevent his downfall, Zeus created the very child most capable of delivering it. He had turned his lover into a ghost and his daughter into a weapon. The thunder in his hand might silence rebellion, but it couldn't silence the echo of Metis forging deep inside him. Prometheus had watched the rise of Zeus with eyes that saw too far, a titan who hadn't fallen fully with his kin. He believed knowledge was worth more than thunder. He shaped mankind out of clay, bent low over mud and water, and whispered life into figures the gods thought beneath their notice. Zeus saw it differently. To him, mortals were pawns, fodder for temples, sacrifices, and flattery. They weren't meant to think. They were meant to obey. Mini-hook thunder keeps you quiet, but fire makes you question why you're in the dark. Prometheus gave them fire, a spark, stolen from the forge of the gods, hidden in a stalk of fennel and smuggled down to earth. With it came warmth against winter, light against fear, and tools sharper than claws. Mortals began to carve wood, melt ore, build walls. They could resist, they could imagine. And Zeus, watching from the clouds, felt his stomach twist the way Kronos' had before. Fire wasn't just flame, it was defiance. He punished Prometheus with precision. Chained to a rock at the edge of the world, his arms spread wide like a warning sign, he was left for the eagle. Every morning it tore open his flesh, dug into his liver, and feasted while he screamed. Every night, the wound closed, only for dawn to reset the torment. This was justice, Zeus said, but it looked more like fear wearing armor, and that wasn't the only sentence he wrote. To mankind he delivered a gift wrapped in cruelty, Pandora, the first woman, shaped with charm, beauty, and a jar sealed tight. Zeus gave her to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, knowing curiosity is a seed that never dies. When the jar opened, sickness, sorrow, envy, and every small agony spilled into the world. Only hope clung to the rim. Some call it mercy, others call it a joke. Minihook, ask yourself, was it punishment for stealing fire, or insurance against mortals getting ideas again? Sisyphus felt it too. A king too clever for his own good. He tricked Thanatos, chained death itself, and for a while the world stopped dying. Zeus snapped. For his arrogance, Sisyphus was condemned to roll a boulder uphill for eternity. Each push reached the brink. Each stone slid back. The gods called it fitting. Mortals called it a mirror. Who hasn't felt the grind of endless labour that erases itself by morning? Ixion joined the ledger next. He murdered kin, lied to Zeus's face, and tried to seduce Hera herself. For that, he was strapped to a burning wheel, spinning through the sky forever. A warning shot. A billboard in the cloud's betrayal won't just break you, it will make you spectacle. Zeus built a pattern. Prometheus on his rock, Sisyphus on his hill, Ixion on his wheel, Pandora with her jar. Each story carved a rule into mortal minds challenge me, and the punishment never ends. He didn't need armies in every city. He needed fear in every heart. But look closer. Every punishment outlived its purpose. Mortals still lit fires, still built cities, still told the tales. Prometheus became a martyr. Sisyphus became a symbol. Even Pandora's jar left behind the thing Zeus hated most, hope. The harder he tried to nail the world down, the more it slipped through his fingers. That's the flaw in tyranny. You can chain the body, but the story keeps running. And in stories, thunder doesn't last forever. Thunder doesn't last forever, but fear tries. It seeps into rooms, into routines, into glances that look like respect until you listen closely and hear the quiet grind of resentment underneath. Hera listened. She had smiled through ceremonies, lit the hearth, tightened the crown. She knew the schedules that kept Olympus obedient. She also knew the way Zeus's eyes tracked a door, the way his hand hovered over the bolt he could throw without moving. Love is complicated. Humiliation is simple. She counted the nights he didn't come home and the mornings he made the rules anyway. She counted until the number felt like a noose. Mini hook. There's a point in every workplace where the group chat gets louder than the meeting. She didn't move first. She watched. Poseidon arrived one afternoon. Sea in his beard, patience thinning. He didn't bend the knee. He leaned against a column and let the room feel how heavy he was. The storms, he said. You keep them too long over my harbours. Zeus said it was weather. Poseidon said weather doesn't hold grudges. The conversation ended when clouds gathered where no wind blew, after he left. Hera traced lightning scars on the marble with her thumb and thought, this is a marriage between three brothers and one sky. Athena kept her counsel inside her helmet. She'd been born from Zeus's pain, and learned early that gratitude is a leash if you let it. She loved order, loved cities, loved rules that stayed the same in daylight and dark. Zeus's rules were different, flexible when useful, iron when threatened. She didn't argue, she recorded every arbitrary punishment, every exception for himself, every time truth took the stairs while thunder took the elevator. Apollo felt it in the music. His hymns fell flat in rooms where people clapped because it was expected. He was sun and medicine and light, and he hated the way fear makes people sick before any plague arrives. He was loyal, but loyalty isn't blindness, it's choosing to see and stay anyway. Lately, he found himself looking away. The four of them, Hera, Poseidon, Athena. Apollo didn't meet in a conspiracy cave with torches and whispers. They met in plain sight, at a festival where mortals told stories about the gods to feel better about their lives. The wine was good, the laughter had edges, a comment here, an eyebrow there. The plan didn't drop into the world fully formed. It grew like ivy. On a windless night they tested a rumour. What if he were contained, not killed? No one was dreaming that dream, just bound long enough to show him the cost of his own fear. No one owned the sentence. It sat in the air between them, a coin rolling along the lip of a cup. Poseidon said chains. Athena said leverage. Hera said timing. Apollo said, softly. That light helps knots make sense. High above the halls where petitions curled like smoke, Hephaestus worked. The smith god had a limp and a patience that made metal admit things. Hera visited the forge with a jar of oil and a question dressed as flattery. A net, she said, that no one sees until it's too late. Hephaestus smiled without his eyes and asked what it was for. She said, truth. He asked again. She said, safety. A craftsman knows when a commission is honest. He forged anyway, filaments thin as breath, stronger than oaths, woven with words that snag pride like fishhooks. Mini-hook, you can tell how much a god fears you by how invisible the trap has to be. The day they chose looked ordinary. Zeus called assembly. The floor gleamed. The air had that clean, post-rain quiet that makes you expect good news. He took his throne, lazy in a way that meant alert. Hera stood close enough to touch and far enough not to. Athena kept her hand still. Apollo tuned a lyre with more care than necessary. Poseidon came late, bringing the smell of harbour ropes and salt. When the net fell, it fell like a decision already made. No flourish, no announcement. 1 second Zeus was a man in a chair. The next second he tried to move and didn't. The threads drew tight. They bit into wrist and ankle, shoulder and throat, a spiderweb that tasted like vows. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then the room remembered how to breathe. Zeus didn't. He pulled, and the net answered with the voice of Hephaestus's anvil no. The thunder in his palm fizzled against words designed to dull lightning. He tried the tone that always emptied the air around him, the command that makes cowards of brave men. The net didn't have ears. Hera stepped forward. There was no triumph on her face. Triumph is for clean victories. This wasn't clean. We're tired, she said. Poseidon stood where Zeus could see him and didn't smile. Athena named the charges because someone had to arbitrate justice, humiliation as policy, the leak of fear into everything. Apollo said there was a way to lead that didn't make people sick. Zeus laughed then, sharp and wrong. Family, he said, and the word sounded like a weapon dropped point first. He spun his eyes across the hall, counting allies, calculating exits. Hermes looked at the floor. Ares looked at Hera, and then looked away. Demeter, remembering her own griefs, didn't move. Hestia's flame flickered like a woman choosing prayer over war. Release me, Zeus said. And for the first time in too long, the room considered the possibility of saying no. The moment stretched. This was the highest point of the ledge, the place where a story leans forward to see if it will fall. Apollo's hand shook on the strings. Athena's jaw clicked. Hera's throat worked like she was swallowing something she wanted to spit. Poseidon shifted his weight, and the columns noticed. Far below the clouds, Thetis was listening. A sea nymph with a memory for debts. She had once saved Hephaestus when the sky rejected him, and he had paid her in friendship. News travels fast when it's heavy. She understood nets. She also understood what happens when a throne is left empty long enough for old gods to remember their names. She whistled into water. It carried the sound to the 100-handed, to Briareus Aegeon, the man-mountain, who could turn a room into a forest of fists. He climbed out of the sea like a continent standing up and shook the surface off his shoulders. Thetis didn't order him. She asked. He didn't pledge loyalty to Zeus. He pledged loyalty to balance. Sometimes the only thing worse than a tyrant is a power vacuum. By the time he reached Olympus, the argument had calcified. The net held. Hera had said all the words that had kept her alive this long. Athena had laid out the map of consequences with the coolness of a surgeon. Apollo had tried a song like a bridge and found no one willing to cross it. Poseidon had offered alternatives that sounded like threats because they were. Briareus didn't argue. He ducked the eaves and filled the hall with the sound of rocks remembering they were old. The net tightened as if it knew his name. He put one hand on a thread, and it hissed. He put another hand on another thread, and it smoked. He looked at Hera. She met his eyes and didn't flinch. He looked at Zeus. Zeus's mouth had that edge it gets when he thinks of Kronos. Enough, Briareus rumbled, and it wasn't a verdict so much as a boundary. You don't cage thunder, you teach it where to go. He cut the net with a motion like a horizon lifting. The threads recoiled with a sound like broken promises. Zeus stood, breath ragged, wrists lined, eyes bright with an anger that wanted to become a policy. He could have made that moment into a massacre. He didn't. Not because mercy had finally occurred to him, because Briareus was still in the room, and the sea held its breath. Hera braced. Poseidon braced. Athena recalculated. Apollo played one clear note just to prove sound could be clean again. Zeus spoke without thunder. "The sky is mine," he said, "but it is not a leash around your throats." It was almost generous. Almost. Then he turned to Hera. "You," he said, and the you held a decade's worth of unslept nights. He didn't strike her. He hung her once, famously high and helpless, anvils at her ankles, until the gods begged and he relented. That version exists. In this telling, he learned something from the way Briareus watched him. He chose a different cruelty visibility. He hung the net instead. He draped it above the council table where everyone could see the weave that had held him. He left it there like art, like warning, like a lesson. Here is what happens when you forget who keeps the weather. Then he summoned Hephaestus and thanked him for his craftsmanship with a coin made of flattery. The smith bowed as a man bows who has built a trap that worked and a conscience that doesn't like how it felt. What changed? Less than you want, and more than you'd think. Zeus stopped calling every whim a law. He started calling some of them requests. He listened longer. He humiliated people in private more often than in public. Hera learned where the new lines were and drew her anger inward, where it fermented. Poseidon returned to the sea with the taste of almost on his tongue. Athena wrote 2 versions of every rule, one that would be printed, one that would be practiced. Apollo wrote a hymn to balance and sang it once. Minihook power that survives a coup doesn't get kinder, it gets smarter. The coup that wasn't became a rumour mortals told in kitchens when the wind sounded like footsteps. Did you hear they said? They tried to bind the sky. The sky let them live. The story comforted people who had bosses. It terrified people who were bosses. Zeus kept the net where he could always see it. Sometimes at night he reached up and touched it like a man touches a scar. He didn't forgive. That isn't what he did. He adapted. He gave out small kindnesses like coins to children, and they shone because everyone remembered the alternative. He also crafted new ways to make disobedience feel like a misunderstanding instead of a crime. Fear works better when it's polite. Hera didn't plan another coup. She planned smaller things with sharper teeth. A wrong word here. A cold feast there. A curse that looks like a blessing if you squint. Athena watched and learned the geometry of surviving power without becoming it. Apollo took more trips to the mortal world, where people were messy and grateful and didn't ask their son to vote on thunder policy. Some nights the 3 brothers would still sit together, Poseidon with his trident, Hades with his ledger, Zeus with his sky. They would talk like men who will never say I'm sorry and mean I'm still here. Respect, maybe. Fear, definitely. Love. That's a mortal luxury. Call the entire episode a failure if you want. It failed to remove Zeus. It succeeded in drawing the line he pretended wasn't needed. Olympus learned that a throne isn't a person. It's a weather pattern. You can't topple a storm in one night, but you can teach it where not to strike. And somewhere deep in the place where he kept the old lessons, Zeus stored a new one. The people closest to you are the only ones who can reach the switch. He slept a little lighter after that. He woke a little faster. He learned to hear the difference between obedience and silence. The net stayed up. The sky stayed his. The fear stayed everybody's. The net still hung above the council chamber when the ground beneath Olympus started to mutter. Not politics this time. Something older, deeper. The sky flickered, not with Zeus's thunder, but with a soundless pressure that made even clouds curl away. Down below, the earth cracked, and from it rose Typhon the monster. The poets never wanted to describe too closely because language itself buckled around him. He was vast. His shoulders scraped the stars. His hands were vipers, hundreds of them, hissing, spitting venom hot enough to scar stone. His body writhed with wings and coils, and his eyes weren't eyes at all but furnaces. The air stank of sulphur and inevitability. Typhon wasn't just a beast. He was the last son of Gaia, sent as the god's punishment for daring to lock her children in Tartarus. He wasn't here to test Zeus. He was here to end him. Minihook, Imagine every nightmare you've ever had about snakes, storms, and earthquakes, then put them all in one body and give it a grudge. Zeus rallied the Olympians, hurling bolts faster than thought. The sky cracked open in white arcs. Typhon laughed. His serpents caught lightning in their jaws and spat it back as fire. He closed the distance in a storm of wings. Zeus fought with all the arrogance of a king, certain the story would bend for him. But arrogance isn't armor. Typhon struck, tore the sickle from Zeus's grip, and slashed the tendons from his arms and legs. The king of the gods fell like a broken statue, blood smoking where it touched the ground. The world shook, mountains buckled, rivers boiled, Olympus reeled. The gods scattered, some diving into rivers, others hiding in caves. Hermes disguised himself as a shepherd. Apollo fled to a foreign land. Even Ares, loud in war, vanished into silence. Hera whispered that prophecy had come for her husband at last. Typhon dragged Zeus across the earth, a prize carried like a warning, and stuffed him into a cavern in Cilicia. There he hid him, binding him with coils and tossing the severed sinews into the dark. Without his strength, Zeus was just a body with rage in his eyes. He had never looked so small. Minihook when the storm god loses his tendons. Thunder sounds like begging. But the story didn't end in that cave. Gaia's son had underestimated loyalty. Hermes, sly as always, crept into the dark, soothed the serpents, and stole back the sinews. Pan joined him, screaming into the night with a cry so hideous it startled even monsters. While Typhon reeled, they fitted Zeus's tendons back into place. Pain seared him alive, but strength returned. He rose, no longer limping, no longer silent. The rematch split the world. Zeus unleashed bolts that melted peaks. Typhon hurled mountains like pebbles, blackening valleys with fire. They clashed across seas, forests, and plains until the earth itself felt flayed. Finally, Zeus gathered every ounce of sky, every spark of rage and fear, and drove a bolt straight through Typhon's chest. The monster convulsed, shrieking with a sound that cracked glass in mortal villages. He fell, buried beneath Mount Etna, where his breath still boils as volcanic fire. The gods returned, timid and triumphant. Zeus stood, bloodied but unbroken, and declared the order eternal. Olympus was safe again, but the lesson lingered in his bones. For the first time, he had been beaten bound, humiliated, nearly erased. Thunder had met something louder. From then on, each rumble of Etna was a reminder. Power can stumble. The sky itself can be cut open. And the king of the gods, no matter how many bolts he threw, would never again sleep without hearing coils move in the dark. The net still hung above the council table, a quiet lace of threat. When the mountain under Olympus began to murmur, not the kind of tremor that rattles goblets and gives mortals a good story for market day. Deeper, older, a pressure in the bones the way your ears ring before a blast, the way animals freeze before the first crack of a storm they remember from a lifetime they never lived. Clouds peeled back like lids, the horizon thickened. Something was pushing up from the seam between earth and whatever kept it angry. The air tasted like a struck match. Typhon stood. He didn't rise so much as assemble, every nightmare in geology signing its name at once. Shoulders that crowded constellations, a torso braided with serpents, each head tasting the air, each mouth rehearsing ruin. The hands weren't hands. They were nests of vipers, tongues like sparks, venom so hot it etched its name in stone. Wings unfurled that turned day into the memory of night. He looked at Olympus with a face that had never learned the word enough. Minihook, if thunder is a voice, Typhon was the throat it stole to sing through. Zeus felt the shift before the first roar. He lifted his hand, and bolts flocked to him like trained hawks, their feathers bright. "With me," he said, and the word carried. Athena took her place at his flank, eyes narrowed to slits of calculation. Apollo drew light into his bow until the string hummed with noon. Poseidon rolled his shoulders, and the chamber smelled like rope and salt. Ares bristled. Hermes swallowed. They met Typhon over the ridge where cloud meets cliff, the same place they had divided the world and called it peace. Peace didn't come to the meeting. Zeus threw lightning like a man pitching ladders across a flood. The sky cracked white. Typhon laughed. a sound like boulders remembering they used to be mountains. His serpents caught the bolts in their mouths and chewed. He closed the distance with a storm of wings. Arrogance is a bad helmet. Zeus struck first, 10 times, 20, each bolt carving daylight into smoke. Typhon reached through the light, caught Zeus's wrist, and squeezed until the bones spoke. A coil whipped around Zeus's legs, yanked, and the king of the gods hit the ground so hard the ground answered back. The sickle iron cold, moon-sharp glinted in Typhon's grip. The cut wasn't theatrical. It was efficient. A single sweep opened Zeus like a man separating sinew from bone for soup. Tendons from arms and legs, those threads that turn intention into action, slid free and landed wet in Typhon's palm. Zeus convulsed. The thunder in his hand stuttered. He tried to stand. His body said no. The world lurched. Olympus flinched. A valley folded in on itself like a bad thought. Rivers boiled, then ran backward, as if trying to return to a time before this problem existed. Mortals collapsed in fields and called it a sign. Priests threw incense at the sky. Fishermen pointed at the water and didn't speak because the water was pointing back. The gods scattered in ways they would deny later. Apollo's music went brittle. He turned his face east and ran where people still adored him by name. Athena didn't run, she withdrew, counting exits, counting costs, counting which standard survive a fall. Ares raised his spear and then lowered it because this wasn't a war he understood. Hermes turned into a shepherd because sometimes the smartest disguise is a job that looks like work. Hera watched without blinking. You can call that cruelty if you want. It was also honesty. She had warned every room that would listen, fear makes bad rulers worse. Now she waited to see which story this would be. Typhon dragged Zeus like a prize down the flank of the world. Every scrape of Zeus's body carved a new rumour into the mountains. He carried him to a cave in Cilicia, a hole in the earth that knew how to keep things, and stuffed him inside. As for the severed sinews, Typhon tossed them into the dark, where a dragoness, Delphine, coiled around them and hissed a promise to eat anything that came looking. Mini hook when the storm god loses his tendons. Thunder sounds like begging. Zeus, bound in coils, stared at the cave roof and saw a ceiling he did not own. He tried to flex a hand that didn't respond and was surprised by the grief in that surprise. Pain wasn't new to him. Helplessness was. It tasted like a childhood he thought he had outlived the cave on Crete. The drumline of Coretta's banging lies into lullabies, a mother pressing quiet into his mouth with calloused fingers. He had learned to hide and strike. Now he could do neither. He spoke to the rock. I am not done. The rock did not argue. The rock had seen kings. Outside, the world wore Typhon's mood. Forests lay down in ash. Sea foam turned black where it touched certain shores. Shepherds tied bells to their wrists at night, so they'd have something to count besides fear. In villages, mothers told children to sleep, and the children asked what sleep was. Somewhere in Phrygia, a man who had never believed in gods knelt anyway, and the ground shook once to let him know it had heard. Olympus tried to breathe. The net over the council table glimmered in the strange light. Hephaestus hammered without being asked. A man who fixes because there is a thing to fix. Hestia kept the flame because someone had to. Poseidon stood at the edge of his sea and watched waves consider being walls. Hades wrote a column in his ledger and underlined it twice. Hermes is a coward in none of the stories that matter. He went down. He moved through the world the way whisper does, around corners, under doors, over a sleep. When he reached the cave, Delphine lifted her head and unrolled her tongue like a map of ways to die. Little god, she said, and the words came out wet. Why are you here, tourism? Hermes said, and smiled the kind of smile that disarms a room by admitting it knows what it is. He held out a wineskin. For your throat. Guarding is dry work. Delphine laughed a sound like pebbles in a barrel and snapped at the air close enough to rattle his teeth. She didn't drink. She wound tighter around the bundle that smelled like Zeus's life, and the cave got colder. Pan arrived because sometimes panic is a tool and sometimes it is a friend who answers when you don't have time to send a formal invitation. Goat-footed, bright-eyed, a grin that made people mistake him because they wanted to. He lifted his pipes and let loose a noise so wrong the cave remembered other days it had been afraid. Delphine flinched. Just once. Just enough. Hermes slipped behind her coils and into the shadows where her skin lay rough, rank, stitched around something that throbbed without blood. He slid the bundle into his bag with a movement that would not be admired unless the observer understood the skill in not existing while doing something crucial. Delphin came back to herself and roared. Pan roared louder, which is to say he screamed in a way that made the word scream seem polite. Rocks cracked. Birds dropped out of trees 3 countrysides away. Typhon paused. No one paused him and turned his head to see what had the gall to be ugly in his presence. That heartbeat was the kind of blank space you spend your life hoping will show up when you need it. Hermes ran. Pan ran. Running is holy when it saves a life that matters. They reached Zeus in the dark. He did not say thank you, not because he wasn't grateful, because language is small when pain is big. Hold still, Hermes said. I am tied to a dragon, Zeus said, and the dryness in his voice sounded like his mother when she'd had enough. Pan held the coils back with hands and hooves, and a willingness to be kicked by myth. Hermes unstitched the skin and pressed the tendons back where tendons belong. There are places in the body where putting something right hurts worse than the original break. Zeus saw stars and then saw nothing, and then saw stars for real, not just the kind that spur from pain. Hephaestus had taught Hermes a thing or two about knots that hold. Hermes used all of them. The work reeked of iron and will. When Zeus's fingers curled of their own accord, when a knee lifted without being asked, the cave changed shape. Not literally. The way a room does when someone dangerous remembers their name. Typhon returned to a mouth of earth that smelled like loss. He reached in, sure of an outcome he thought he had bought and paid for. The hand that grabbed him was not the hand of a captive. It was the hand of a man who had decided something. They fought across the map like 2 ideas trying to outlaw each other. Over Cassius, through Thrace, across plains that had only just learned how to be fields. Typhon hurled mountains like boys skip stones. Peaks thudded into valleys and stayed. Rivers leapt out of their beds and sprinted as if late. Zeus called the winds the Anemoi by their old names. Notus and Boreas, Eurus and Zephyrus, and they came, unrolling the sky into 4 hands that pressed where he told them to press. He called for bolts new forged, cyclopes blinking their one eyes as sparks lit beards, and the air filled with weapons that hummed like bees too furious to make honey. He learned from his loss. He didn't stand and dare the monster to do his worst. He moved. Strategy where swagger used to be. He baited and turned, boxed Typhon between gust and cliff, let him roar into crosswinds that tore the roar into scraps. He aimed not for glory shots, but for tendons, joints, the hinges of rage. For the first time anyone could remember, Zeus fought like a student. He listened to Athena without her asking to be heard. Typhon adapted. Rage learns. He spat fire that ran like water, set forest to screaming, licked the legs out from under whole hills. He flew low, then higher, then dove, serpents snapping at anything that dared to be alive. He tried to wrap the winds up in himself and wear them like a coat. They met over Sicily because geography likes a good story. The island shuddered, and in the shudder Zephyrus clipped Typhon's wing with a slap of sweet air. Not enough to fell him, enough to tilt him. Zeus gathered everything the sky had ever taught him. Every storm, every bright afternoon, every night that had held its breath and hoped to see morning. He pulled it into a bolt that wasn't one bolt so much as a thesis on sovereignty. He threw. It didn't hit Typhon so much as decide to exist where Typhon was standing. The blast rang in the bones of things that didn't have bones. Serpents went still. Wings lost the word for up. Typhon arched, all fury and flame and unwillingness, and crashed. The ground opened because it had to. Sicily buckled to make room. Zeus drove the heat down, 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 until silence came up. Mount Etna rose where the wound settled. It smokes because stories don't end. They subside. Every time the mountain rumbles, it's not just geology, it's breath. The gods arrived in stages, like guests who aren't sure the party survived the fight in the kitchen. Apollo wiped ash from his face with the back of his hand and called the sun back to its root. Athena took inventory with a mind that hated waste. Poseidon tapped the coastline with his trident and told the water to behave. Demeter knelt and pressed a palm to blackened ground until it thought about green. Hermes laughed too loud and then coughed because he'd forgotten to stop running. Hera watched Zeus, not with love, not with pure hate either. She watched the way a woman watches a man who almost learned something. He stood there bleeding in places only power notices. He didn't raise his hand to be adored. He didn't ask for wine. He looked at Etna as if he'd put a lid on a jar and was listening for whether the lid would rattle. Then he looked up at the corner of the sky where he keeps the part of himself that doesn't sleep. Changes came like adjustments to an old house. You don't knock down walls. You move the furniture so no one stubs their toe in the dark. Zeus built redundancies. He drilled the winds like soldiers. He mapped routes mortals couldn't see, sky lanes that would let bolts arrive faster than fear could. He spoke to the Cyclopes about cadence. Not just force make me weapons that tire monsters in the joints. Not just the eyes. He called Hermes into a room and said, "When things fall, who runs?" Hermes said, "The ones who know where the doors are." Zeus said, "Show me all the doors." Athena drafted rules for disasters. The kind mortals centuries later would call preparedness. She designed signals the birds would understand and passed them to Apollo, who whistled them into being. Hestia stockpiled light. Hephaestus forged braces that would hold temples when the ground forgot itself. Poseidon placed stones in harbours that told waves how to behave and taught certain fishermen certain prayers that were really timing. Hades, from his border, adjusted the ledger to accept what would come during quakes and ashfall. He is not cruel. He is organised. He told Persephone that above ground would be darker for a while. She said she knew. Spring is a negotiator when it has to be. Mortals, for their part, learned Etna's schedule like a neighbour's temper. They built their lives with one ear for the rumble. They planted, harvested, and learned the trick of looking up without looking scared. Somewhere a man made a charm from a piece of black glass and swore it kept nightmares where the mountain kept theirs. Somewhere a woman named her dog Ty and laughed in a way that had relief in it. Not everything grew kinder. Zeus didn't become soft. He became exact. There's a difference. He stopped pretending he was invincible and started insisting he was inevitable. It's a subtler cruelty. Fear that has learned manners lasts longer. He still looked at the net some nights. The one Hephaestus wove. The one Briareus cut. He had kept it hanging over the table like art in a room that doesn't deserve art. After Typhon, the net meant something else. Not humiliation now, horizon, a reminder that anything can be caught if it doesn't move smart. Sometimes he touched the threads the way a man touches a scar. You can call that tenderness if you want. It was inventory. Pan woke to temples he hadn't asked for. Little altars tucked into hillsides by people who didn't know his whole name, but knew they owed thanks to whatever had screamed at the right time. He took it with a shrug. Hermes received sandals from a prince who said he liked stories where the runner wins. Hermes took those too. There were tales that said during the first panic, the gods had fled to Egypt and put on animal faces to hide Apollo a hawk, Artemis a cat, Hermes an ibis with clever eyes, Zeus a ram because rams look good on coins. Maybe they did. Maybe it was priests drawing maps over maps to make sense of why their gods suddenly looked familiar in other places. Myth is generous. It lets more than one thing be true if the truths rhyme. Zeus heard the stories and did not correct them. If mortals wanted to believe their gods had been scared enough to become animals, let them. Fear makes worship cling harder. He dreamed of coils. Not often. Enough. In the dream, Typhon didn't speak. He didn't need to. The pressure said plenty. Zeus would wake with the taste of ash and think of Kronos, of caves, of the way lessons echo. Power had taught him one kind of silence. Typhon taught him another, the silence after you scream yourself empty and the mountain still hums. He started counting, not just enemies, scenarios. What do we do if the ground takes sides again? Who carries whom if Hermes is the one who trips if a temple falls? Which roof do we hold up, first grain or song? Athena loved those nights. Not because she loved fear, because she loved a plan that didn't lie about what it took to hold a sky in place. Poseidon and Zeus stood together more often. Two storms comparing notes without speaking much. If Etna opens her mouth, Poseidon would say, "Do you want the sea in it, or out of it?" Zeus would answer, and they would both watch the horizon to see if the horizon agreed. Hera did not forgive him for what he is. She did not forget that even in defeat he had found a way to turn the story into a lesson about his endurance. But she also didn't miss the way he looked at their halls like a man who has learned there are more ways to lose than one. She adjusted too. Fewer public fights. More private lines that he learned he would not cross unless he wanted certain rooms colder than volcanoes. Etna coughed. Villagers paused. Then the cough thinned and the villagers exhaled in one long shudder that looked like men setting down buckets and women sitting down on steps. Children asked if the mountain was hungry. Parents said maybe. Someone said the mountain ate monsters so you didn't have to. The children slept. If you stand on certain nights in certain places and listen very carefully, you can hear wind climbing the mountain doing drills. Zeus put that there. Not to be adored, to be ready. Readiness is the religion of people who learn to live after. The old poets argued later about details. Was it a bearskin or a chest? Was the dragoness a woman with scales or a snake with opinions? Did Zeus bleed gold or the same red as men? Did the 100-handed stir and then go back to sleep? Or did they watch from the edge and decide this wasn't their kind of work? Pick your version. The point is the same for a moment that was longer than it should have been. The sky wasn't in charge, and then it was again. We live in between those sentences. Zeus looked at Etna for the last time that season and decided not to throw a victory festival. He told the Cyclopes to rest their hands. He told Hermes to carry a message to river gods about not drowning people who prayed with bad grammar. He told Hades to expect fewer arrivals for a while and meant it like a gift. He told Apollo to play in public again. Apollo asked if the clapping would be real this time. Zeus said yes. Apollo believed him. Night stretched, soft as it gets when the world has earned it. The sky held, not because it can't fall, but because for now, nobody is pushing. That should have been the end of it. But you know how fear works. Once it finds a crack, it keeps a map. Zeus started looking down more, past the mountain, past the sea, past the temples with their polite fires. He looked at people. Not adoration this time. Behavior. He saw cities grow fat and then careless. He saw men build on floodplains and ask the gods to respect their blueprints. He saw kings make promises to rivers and then forget. He saw the way stories harden into entitlement if you let them. He told himself it was vigilance. Maybe it was. It was also the beginning of another kind of storm, the kind where the sky insists on teaching lessons water already knows. Mini-hook when a god decides the world needs a reset. The first voice to argue is the rain. But that's later. For now, Etna sleeps with one eye open. Pan has a temple in a place that smells like thyme and goat. Hermes owns a pair of sandals he pretends aren't his favourite. Athena keeps a drawer full of plans labelled what if. Poseidon hums to himself when the tides are on time. Hades balances his books and does not gloat. Hera sharpens sympathy into a tool. And Zeus, on the high terrace, counts the seconds between rustles in the dark and decides which ones are snakes and which ones are wind. He has learned that even kings wear tendons like everyone else. He has learned that some victories bury themselves and smoulder. He has learned that the distance between certainty and ash is about as wide as a mountain's mouth. He has not learned to sleep. A new cloud rises from the west with more water than weather. It doesn't look like anger yet. It looks like patience gathering itself. The mountain is quiet. The net is quiet. The council is quiet. The rain, somewhere far away, is practicing names. The first drop hit the terrace like a coin on marble. Then another. The net above the council table barely stirred, but the air thickened, heavy with that just-before smell the world gets when it's about to change its mind. Zeus watched the western cloud bank pile up like a slow verdict. Etna was quiet. The winds were drilled and ready. Still, he kept counting, as if numbers could keep a sky from doing what it wanted. You can call it vigilance. It was also hunger in a new suit. He had been looking down more, not at temples, but at habits. Kings trading justice like favours. Judges taking bribes in daylight. Men swearing by rivers and then damning them for profit. Cities building on floodplains and accusing storms of bad manners. Up here, fear had learned to behave. Down there, arrogance was learning to sing. He took it to council and dressed it as policy. The world, he said, needs a reset. Hera looked at the rain, and the rain looked back. Athena kept her voice even. Teach them, she said, or break them. These are the only two ways power talks. Poseidon rolled a pebble in his palm until it sounded like surf. You know my answer, he said, and the room smelled like brine. The decision didn't come from one argument. It came from the kind of accumulation mortals call a bad year and gods call a pattern. It sharpened the night Zeus visited Arcadia in the shape of a traveller and knocked on Lycaon's door. Lycaon was a king who liked to test the gods the way boys test thin ice. He welcomed the stranger with a smile that didn't bother hiding its teeth. He told his cooks to prepare a feast and to add a course no guest should ever be offered, a boy's flesh, salted with contempt. If the stranger was a god, let him prove it. If he wasn't, let him choke. Zeus sat and watched and listened and did the thing he does worse nothing until the platter landed. The smell was wrong. Not wrong like foreign spice. Wrong like a house where a scream has lived for a long time. He stood without thunder. He turned the table without raising his hand. He looked at Lycaon and let the silence be longer than a mortal heart can handle. "Congratulations," he said softly. "You wanted proof." The roof blew open. The hall went white and then ash. Lycaon didn't die. He learned a new shape. Fur burst where pride had been. His mouth filled with teeth he had earned. He bolted into the dark on 4 legs, the first wolf with a man's memory, and in the forest, deer learned a new caution. One house is a lesson. A nation is a map. The map showed a sickness that wouldn't respond to sermons. Mini hooks and stains don't scrub out. You have to strip the wall. Zeus chose water. He did not swing a hammer and shout flood. He did something colder. He sent Hermes to Prometheus with a message that wasn't a message, just the kind of warning you give a man smart enough to infer the rest. He told Iris to circle certain skies. He told the winds to hold back until they were told to stop holding back. He met Poseidon on a shoulder of cloud and nodded, and Poseidon nodded back the way a man does when a plan fits his appetite too neatly. The rain started honest. Farmers smiled, tilted faces up, let the first drops slick dust into good mud. In cities, women pulled laundry off lines and grinned at the timing. Then the rain kept going. It found its own rhythm and then ignored it, like drummers who liked the echo too much to stop. Courtyards became ponds. Streets learned to forget their names. People slapped water off forearms and said just a storm. In the mountains, springs that had behaved for centuries remembered they had other settings. A seam opened in the ground the way a seam opens in a shirt when someone decides they're tired of breathing politely. Water erupted, not one spout, thousands. Poseidon took his trident and touched the place where rivers begin, and they began again. For 9 days and nights or longer, counting failed where the sky had no interest in telling time the world filled. Roofs rode waves like ships. Real ships climbed hills they had never met. Herds bunched on the last dry humps of land and looked at the horizon as if it could be negotiated with. Temples floated and then didn't. Trees let go of the ground and drifted until they learned the word uprooted from the inside. Deucalion had been warned. He was Prometheus's son, a man who knew that most miracles come late and most disasters come early. He loved a woman named Pyrrha, the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, which is to say, her blood remembered curiosity and consequence in the same breath, when Hermes passed by pretending to hum and not look anyone in the eye. Deucalion read the space around him and started building. Not a ship with masts and glory, a chest. Planks planed smooth, corked tight, corners married with patience. He and Pyrrha packed it with what they could carry and what they couldn't bear to leave flint and twine, seed and salt, blankets that smelled like their house, a small bag of earth from the garden for no practical reason at all. They argued about a comb. They packed the comb at the last minute. Pyrrha tied up a little jar of oil wrapped in cloth. For the hinges, she said, which was a way to say for anything. When the water came up the steps, Deucalion closed the lid. The chest lifted, stuttered, and floated. Their house let go of them. Pyrrha's mother's cup tapped the window once and vanished. In the dark, wood speaks. It creaks when it remembers it was a tree. The chest moaned, ropes groaned. Deucalion's knuckles went white on a loop of line that didn't need him to hold it, but needed someone to. Pyrrha pressed her palm to the lid until the rhythm of her heartbeat gave the wood something to tune to. They counted each other's breaths. They said thank you to no one in particular when the chest didn't roll. They said nothing when it did. Minnie Hook, if you've ever tried to sleep on a red-eye, you know the religion of small noises. Outside, the world unstitched. Men who had thought themselves storms learned they were rain. Kings tried to command rivers and learned what rivers think of orders. A woman tied her baby to herself with a scarf, and the knot held. And that was a story no poet wrote because it belonged to the woman. On a hill that became an island that became a rumour, shepherds pulled each other into trees and sang to keep from counting. Somewhere, A couple who had meant to meet under an olive tree on a clear night looked up from different rafts and understood that their story now lived in separate tenses. Someone prayed who had never prayed and meant it. Someone prayed who prayed every day and didn't. Zeus did not gloat. He watched. He tracked the lines of water the way an accountant tracks columns. Poseidon's sea laughed without mirth. Hera stood with her hands in her sleeves and said nothing. Athena wrote a new rule and set it aside because new rules feel false when the world is drowning. On the 7th night, the chest had splintered 2 fingernails of Pyrrha's before she stopped counting nights. The sky did a thing it hadn't done since storms learned manners. It echoed itself. Lightning didn't fork, it layered. Thunder didn't roll, it stood up. Deucalion lifted the lid a fraction and saw a sky so close to the water that it was one thought, and he shut it again and pressed the latch. "Tell me a story," Pyrrha said. Which one, he asked. Out of habit, because when people ask that, it means they don't know which stories they can bear. "Tell me the one," she said, "where we get to tuck someone in." He told her about a house that never flooded, where bread burned only when they laughed too long, where a child's hair tickled their wrists as they carried them to bed, where the worst thing was a scraped knee. He told her the kind of lies people tell each other during nights that last too long. He told them well. She closed her eyes and pictured a small hand on a blanket, and they both slept for an hour, which later felt like a treasure they had forgotten they owned and found under a floorboard. When the keel scraped stone, it felt like a word coming back after grief tries to eat language. The chest wedged against a shoulder of Mount Parnassus. Deucalion shoved the lid. Fresh air was a slap that wanted to be a kiss. He climbed out and stood on rock that hadn't expected company this week. Pyrrha followed, her legs unsure in the old gravity. They tied the chest with a loop of rope, as if the mountain might change its mind and try to float away. People who've drifted don't trust stillness right away. The world was not a field again. It was a mirror that had forgotten it was supposed to reflect. Below them, water stretched like a memory that insists it's the present. Patches of treetop broke the sheet like punctuation. A temple roof bobbed, turned, bumped into a cliff, and asked permission to become wood again. The sky was tired in a way that felt like no one should speak loudly for a while. They did not cheer, they cried. They did it quietly, the way people do when tears are a utility, not a performance. Deucalion put the garden dirt on the rock and pressed his palm into it because humans need to press their palms into things. Pyrrha opened the little jar of oil and oiled the chest's hinges because boat superstition sticks to the hands and helps. They built a small fire. The smoke went straight up, a good sign. They put their blankets in the sun, and the blankets sighed. They took inventory. They found the comb and laughed because the body needs proof it can still laugh. They didn't have bread. They did have each other. It wasn't enough, and it was... When the water retreated, it didn't do it politely. It sulked first. It inched. It left a slick residue that turned the world into a sleepwalker. It exposed a tree limb here, a boulder there, as if arguing with itself about whether to go. Word reached Themis the way word reaches gods, by being the word that needs hearing. She sat high, clean as law, and when Deucalion and Pyrrha climbed to her, they looked like people who had learned to love stone. "What do we do?" Deucalion asked. He wasn't ashamed to ask. "Pride is heavy. It doesn't float. Cover your heads," Themis said. "Unbelt your clothes. Throw the bones of your mother behind you as you walk." The sentence sat between them like a riddle that had swallowed something you loved. Pyrrha's jaw set. "I won't," she said. "I won't dishonor my mother." "Nor I," Deucalion said. "We survived to be more human, not less." Themis didn't blink. Law often doesn't. "Then think," she said. They sat. They thought. Wind moved in a way that made the words behind you sound like after you, and that made bones sound like something old enough to hold a world. Pyrrha picked up a stone. It was warm from the sun. "The earth is our mother," she said, and the logic clicked into place like a latch. Her bones are stones. She threw the rock behind her. It hit the ground, bounced once, and turned into a woman, dust in her hair, salt on her lips, eyes bright with work. Deucalion threw a stone. It became a man, shoulders squared, hands reaching as if he had just remembered they were his. They laughed, that scared, loud laugh people laugh when miracles finally admit themselves. They threw more each stone a person, not a clone, each body taking shape around the idea that they were meant to live here. The people stood blinking. Not newborns, not ancient. Somewhere exactly in between the way survivors are. They stretched. They looked at the couple on the rock and didn't ask for permission to breathe. Deucalion and Pyrrha kept throwing until their arms shook and their hands hurt and the mountain heard footsteps that weren't echoes anymore. Minnie Hook, a good riddle doesn't hide the answer. It makes you worth it. The first day of not drowning was messy. People needed water that wasn't a threat. They needed shelter that didn't float away to the next idea. They needed names. Deucalion wanted to give them simple ones. Stone, river, sky. But Pyrrha said names should be earned. Let them tell us who they are, she said, and she walked among the new with a comb and a smile that knew how to keep hands busy. One woman took the comb and started braiding someone else's hair, because civilization always starts there or close. They built lean-tos. They found a cave that could be trusted and one that could not. They learned which silt turns to brick and which silt turns to regret. They tried fire and set it wrong and burned fingers. Then they set it right and boiled water. Then they set it better and learned soup. Deucalion taught the trick of rope around a rock. Pyrrha taught the trick of drying herbs on lines they stretched between branches. Someone laughed and spilled a little pot and then apologized to the ground out of habit, as if the ground had agency, which it does. At night, stories rose with the smoke, not the old ones. New ones that started in the water and then pivoted to, but today. And everyone nodded because the pivot from disaster to routine is its own myth. Zeus watched. Hera sat beside him with her hands in her sleeves and her mouth a straight line that was not forgiveness, but was not nothing. Athena leaned forward when Pyrrha thought, and leaned back when the thought turned into something useful. Poseidon raised and lowered tides by hairbreadths to see if he could make fishermen look at him with gratitude instead of dread. Hermes invented a game where you throw stones into a circle and argue about rules, because arguments about harmless things keep people from arguing about the other kind. Did Zeus regret? Regret isn't quite the word. He felt the ache rulers feel when a plan works and costs what it was always going to cost. He did not apologize, he did not celebrate, and he made a note, the way men like him do when you remake the world. Leave a couple on a mountain, give them a riddle they can solve without breaking something sacred, make sure they invent soup early. He also made rules he didn't announce. He told the rain how long it was allowed to love itself before it had to stop. He told Poseidon which springs could be temperamental and which had to behave like old men with schedules. He told the river gods to keep their oaths or find themselves rerouted in dry seasons when prayer tastes like dust. He told the winds quietly to practice saying no to certain clouds. Down below, mortality remembered its job. Wheat waved. Babies cried with the entitled outrage of the living. Someone carved the first post-flood flute and played a song that was half memory and half brag. Dogs learned the new paths and argued with the moon like they'd invented the idea. The first festival was small and clumsy and perfect to stew. A circle, a dance that tripped, a child sleeping against a father's knee while a mother said, "Look at that," and no one needed to. Not everybody loved Zeus for it. That wasn't the goal. Some shook their fists at the sky and meant it. Some learned how to aim curses in a way that didn't hit their own roof. Some built altars with a new ratio, more thank you for rain that stops, less praise for rain that forgets how. It wasn't blasphemy. It was calibration. One night, by the first post-flood hearth, a boy asked Deucalion where people come from now. Deucalion pointed at stones that weren't needed anymore, and at arms that had learned to throw, and at a woman asleep with her cheek on the back of her hand. "We come from work," he said. The boy nodded in that way children do when they are filing a sentence in a drawer they plan to open later. News of the couple who repopulated the world walked farther than carts could. In places where the flood had been a rumour, people still told the story to scare children into finishing chores. In places where the flood had been a roof swallowing a sky swallowing a prayer, people told it softer, with the kind of reverence grief invents after it has cried itself hoarse. Zeus slept less, not because he feared water, because he feared the slow creep of habit. Tyranny is loud. Human indifference is quieter and more patient. He watched for signs, taxes invented with teeth. Judges whose eyes got glassy around gold. Altars that spent more time admiring their own smoke than feeding the hungry. When he saw them, sometimes he threw a bolt far from the target just to remind everyone the sky had opinions. Sometimes he sent Hermes with the law disguised as a joke. Sometimes he did nothing and let the consequences be the teacher, which is a god's way of saying fine. Touch the stove. Hera did not forget Lycaon's table. When a king later tried a smaller cruelty and called it a prank, she walked into his hall with a look that taught fear how to pronounce itself. He learned to be useful or learned to be a wolf. Both outcomes suited her. Athena showed up in cities that named themselves after olive trees and told the people to choose patience over spectacle. Poseidon sank an arrogant pier that built itself too far into his thought. Hades sent a dream to a judge that made him wake up shaking and resign before breakfast. Deucalion and Pyrrha aged like people who earned it. They watched a generation that had never seen the flood get impatient with rules written in water. They told their story less often on purpose, so it wouldn't turn into a bedtime trick. They kept one stone on a shelf as a promise they would never use it again unless the world truly asked. They argued about boiled versus baked like lovers argue about rain versus snow. They buried each other in the order life invented for them and asked nothing more from the gods than a good harvest for whoever came next. Mini-hook survival is flashy for a week. Maintenance is the epic nobody writes until they need it. Years later, in a city with a new name, a woman lit a lamp and told her child about a time when the sky practiced names and then said all of them at once. The child asked if the gods would do it again. The woman said, "Only if we do," and blew out the lamp, and sleep came on schedule. Up on Olympus, Zeus stood under the net and listened for rain that didn't belong to weather. He didn't promise himself he'd never do it again. He promised himself he wouldn't do it easy. He touched the thread that had cut his wrist once and thought about tendons and dragons and the ache that lives in decisions. Then he went out onto the terrace and counted seconds between lightning and the far-off clouds, not because storms were coming, but because counting still steadied the part of him that the flood had not reset. If you want to call it mercy, do. If you want to call it control, you won't be wrong. If you want to sleep, you can. The winds know their drills, the rivers know their beds, the mountain keeps its mouth mostly shut, and somewhere, in a house built far from water because a woman refused to forget, a comb sits on a shelf, oiled and ready, because people who have survived once like to be ready twice. The rain, tonight, is just rain. It taps the roof like a hand that knows the door is locked because it should be, not because it has to be. In the morning, fields will steam, bread will rise, dogs will bark at nothing and be right. The gods will watch and, for once, not intervene. But don't confuse quiet with absence. The sky hears itself, the sea keeps count, and the man on the terrace still checks the horizon with the eyes of a boy who learned early that noise can save you until it drowns you. He kept listening to the rain for a while after it stopped meaning anything, not because the storm would return, but because quiet had started to sound like a dare. From the terrace, he could see the lamps of 1,000 homes come on at once, dots of warmth he had not built. Lives that did not ask him for permission to continue. That should have comforted him. It reminded him, instead, that the world had learned to run without checking the sky every minute. Power gets itchy when it isn't being consulted. Mini-hook kings don't crave love, they crave proof. Proof, for Zeus, often arrived with a child's name on it. Start with the loudest, Heracles. The son everyone thinks proves Zeus was a good father because the ending looks shiny. Strip the polish, and you'll see the scaffolding of pain. Alcmene wanted one life, a quiet marriage to Amphitryon, the man she'd promised before war intervened. Zeus wore that man's face like a costume he didn't deserve, and walked into her room as if fidelity were a puzzle for smaller minds. Heracles came from a trick conceived inside a lie, and before the boy could sit up, Hera braided her fury into the walls of his nursery. 2 snakes slid across the floorboards, fat with death. The baby laughed, grabbed each one by the throat and squeezed until silence. Strength, learned as self-defense, impresses crowds. It also attracts impossible tests. Hera's rage didn't end with hiss and fang. She sent a madness that ate daylight. One afternoon, Heracles came to and found his wife and children dead at his hands. There is a cold part of grief that organizes the room even while it breaks you. It told him to find a king and ask for penance. Eurystheus smiled like a man who loves admin and assigned 12 jobs that were really 12 ways to rub a man's nose in the world's mess. Nemean lion, a hide that wouldn't listen to metal, solved with strangling Heracles wearing the skin after as if to say, "I learned to armor myself by murdering what tried to murder me," which is a sentence that sounds heroic until you live with it. Linnaean Hydra cut one head, 2 Rise anger management turned into whack-a-mole. Augean stables. Years of filth shoveled in an afternoon by rerouting a river tell me that isn't a metaphor for cleaning up your father's politics. The belt of Hippolyta, the horses of Diomedes, the apples guarded by a dragon who never slept, then down to Hades for the dog 3 heads, one job keep grief from leaking. Heracles hauled Cerberus up and proved he could visit death and leave a door unlocked. All the while, Zeus watched the ledger monster removed, city rescued, altar smoke thicker this month. He even helped once or twice, in the way executives help by phoning favours. But fathering isn't the same as sponsorship. After the labours, after the fame, a poisoned shirt burned Heracles alive accident. Jealousy. Fate. Pick your poison, and on his funeral pyre. He finally got promoted god now, married to Hebe, youth bottled and poured forever. Hera called it a truce. Zeus called it legacy. Somewhere in the echo, a boy still wakes up looking for the door he broke in his own home. The gods don't pay child support. They assign quests. Perseus wore a different kind of inheritance. Danae's father heard a prophecy grandson equals death, so he locked his daughter in a bronze room and called that parenting. Zeus didn't break the door. He turned into golden rain and seeped through the only vulnerability the prison had, physics. Danae gave birth and learned that being chosen by a god means you're now a problem king solve with boxes and water. She and her baby floated in a chest until a fisherman named Dictys answered a question the sky wouldn't. What happens next? Perseus grew up on kindness and salt air, 2 things that set bones straight. Then Polydectes, the small king who wanted Danae for himself, set a trap. Bring me the head of Medusa. It sounded like a dare boys say to boys. It was a death sentence dressed like a party game. Zeus provided gifts via middleman Hermes' blade. Athena's mirror shield and the boy learned the lesson. Most of Zeus's sons learned dad helps in signals, not in person. Medusa's head came off cleanly in the stories that admire blade work. The stories that watch longer remember that she once was a woman, that a god forced himself on her in a temple, and punishment landed on her instead of him. Perseus lifted the head and turned a cruel court to stone, rescued Andromeda because you can't build a hero resume without a tied-up princess and a sea monster, and went home victorious enough to fulfill the prophecy anyway, an errant discus finding a Chryseis like truth does eventually. Zeus attended none of it. He let the ark prove him by proxy. If your son redeems your name in a city that didn't ask, do you become a better father retroactively? Statues think so. Trauma keeps its own books. Dionysus never kept books. He kept receipts. Twice born. First from Semele's womb burned to ash by honesty. Then from Zeus's thigh, the kind of scar that makes people forget the first woman existed at all. As an infant, he was hidden like contraband nursed by nymphs. Passed to Ino and Athamas, whose minds Hera broke until they killed what they swore to love. When your origin story is a relay of concealment, you learn 2 things. Musks save you, and frenzy is how you disappear pain. He grew into a god who forgave everything except contempt. He arrived in towns with ivy and drums and said, "Drink, dance, loosen the knot in your chest before it strangles you." Most places said yes. Thebes said no under a king named Pentheus, who believed order meant denying anything that didn't look like a wall. Dionysus offered grace twice, then pulled the thread. Pentheus crept to the hills to spy on women he couldn't control, was mistaken for a beast, and died in hands that should have hugged him, his mother's among them, because mania is cheap until it costs you everything. The morning after, Dionysus gave them back their minds. There is a kind of mercy that feels like cruelty because it leaves you with memory. Zeus did not descend to clean that blood. He let his son teach the lesson he himself could never voice. Intoxication is a rebellion against a world that forgot to be kind. Athena is the daughter who proves a different thesis love as proximity and threat as subtext. Born from the axe blow that relieved Zeus's headache and erased Metis from the minutes, she stood by his throne more than any child dared. Strategy in sandals, restraint in armor. He trusted her judgment until it contradicted his hunger. Then he called it overreach. In wars she tipped scales with a fingertip. In cities she taught law that outlived the judge. He admired the part of himself he saw in her, the caution, the math, and feared the part he couldn't do without the spine that says no to storms. Their closeness was real, so was the distance inside it. You can sit next to power and still never uncoil. Hephaestus wore rejection like a limp you couldn't unsee. Some say Hera made him alone and Zeus threw him when he didn't like the look. Others say he's Zeus's son, and the sky decided ugly wasn't on brand. Either way, he fell all day and landed in a story that made him useful on impact. Thetis raised him. Metal taught him how to hold a thought. He returned with a forge in his chest, built thrones that trapped the sitter, hands that made net and chain and hinges that refused to squeak. Zeus used those hands, even when they embarrassed him. Hephaestus's marriage to Aphrodite was a contract signed in flattery and broken in public. His trap caught his wife with Ares in a web so fine the room forgot to breathe. The laughter that followed didn't make Hephaestus less lonely. It made Zeus look at the ceiling. Fathers who outsource shame produce sons who engineer consequences. Speaking of Ares, if rage needed a body, it would pick his. He swung a spear like it was a sentence, charged first, bled loud. Zeus looked at him the way certain dads look at sons who are too much like them in the ways they hate. "You disgusting thing," he once snapped on a battlefield, when Athena helped a mortal cut Ares and the war god howled. Imagine being the god of a thing your father prides himself on and still being told to sit down every time you show it. Ares learned to love the crash more than the cause. Zeus kept him around like a fire extinguisher he resented owning. Apollo and Artemis were bright children born to Leto after Hera chased their mother across the map and banned labor like cruelty could stop biology. Artemis arrived first, then midwifed her twin, an origin that wrote protector into her bones. Apollo grew into sun and song and plague and medicine, the contradiction that makes mortals nervous. He built temples where order had a pulse, then broke that order when Insult dressed up as Art Marcia strung notes from a skin flute and bragged. And Apollo flayed him for forgetting the line between skill and sacrilege. Later, when Apollo's son Asclepius got too good at healing and brushed the edge of reversing death, Zeus threw a bolt and called it boundary. Children's children are still children in the eyes of the man who fears being replaced. Persephone complicates the family tree and clarifies the pattern. Hades wanted a wife. Zeus co-signed the kidnapping and didn't tell Demeter, as if governance were logistics with better curtains. A field opened. A girl vanished. A mother took the world hostage with grief. Crops quit. People starved. Zeus sent messages instead of apologies. The compromise they made 6 months with her mother, 6 with her husband, became a calendar, and everyone calls it poetry. It began as a father deciding someone else's daughter could learn to love the dark. There are others, Minos, whose crown on Crete led to a labyrinth because men mistake mandate for wisdom. Helen, hatched from Leda's egg. The face that paid for her father's disguise with 10 years of ash. The Muses, daughters who made language stand upright and still had to watch kings fund wars before festivals. Hermes, the useful son, carrying lies and lore with equal charm, earning praise and suspicion in the same breath. Even the minor ones, the rain girls. The river boys learned to scan the sky not for weather, but for mood. If there's a through line, it's this: Zeus loved his children the way a general loves outcomes. He gave, withheld, punished, forgave, promoted, exiled rarely because feelings demanded it, mostly because order did. Love in that house was a performance review. Affection arrived as a bonus after a crisis. Withholding arrived faster and lasted longer. The prophecy that a child would topple him never left his pocket. It wrote the menu. Daughters offered proximity that felt safe until it didn't. Sons offered muscle he could point at problems until they pointed back. Some nights, usually after festivals, when incense made the halls smell like vows nobody planned to keep, he'd list them quietly. A roll call that sounded like gospel and audit at once. Athena at his right, Apollo's hymns clean from the rafters, Artemis's quiver leaning where she'd find it before dawn, Hermes' sandals with dust from 3 continents on them, Hephaestus's tools asleep on the bench, Ares's dented shield propped against a column because polishing is for veterans, Dionysus's ivy drooping in a cup that was never empty, the Muses' footprints like music nobody swept, children as inventory as comfort, mini-hook every dynasty as a family that thinks the last meeting was therapy. Here's the ugly symmetry: Zeus swore he would not be Kronos, and he wasn't. He didn't swallow his children. He swallowed their chances at uncomplicated love. His father devoured bodies, he devoured safety. Even the ones he raised up Heracles apotheosized, Perseus heroized, Apollo and Athena institutionalized, carried the bill in their bones. The world remembers victories. The victors remember what they had to kill in themselves to win, and still, Somehow, they loved him in ways that make mortals judge and envy at the same time. Athena's hand on his shoulder in counsels where he didn't deserve it. Apollo stepping between him and a rumour because sunlight hates sludge. Hermes cracking a joke at exactly the second a room would have broken, letting power pretend it chose to smile. Heracles looking up from a mortal fire and begging a glance from a sky that refused. Dionysus laughing like grief with a mask on, then kissing his father's cheek when wine turned confession into choreography. Ares showing up when it mattered, even if he left early when it didn't. Artemis patting the head of his eagle because animals don't ask who your parents are. If love is measured by ease, the household failed. If love is measured by endurance, it passed. Endurance is the currency of people who are born inside weather. Down below, the lamps on the hills flickered. Somewhere a mother told a child that gods have families too, and the child said, like ours, and the mother said, Messiah, and the child laughed that fearless laugh kids have before they learn better. Somewhere a man taught his son to throw a discus and kept checking the horizon for grandfathers. Somewhere a daughter learned to say no in a voice that sounded like granite and olive. Athena would have smiled at that, and the girl's father, a decent man who still believed thunder means correction, learned to listen without flinching. Zeus leaned on the rail and counted again. Not the rain now, not the lamps, but the beats between names his and theirs and the ones who would come after and make their own weather. He wanted to believe fear could be managed like wind, that if he drilled it enough it would behave. Maybe it would. More likely, his children would keep teaching him the only lesson he never wrote down: you cannot outrun the echo of your house, but you can change the pitch. He exhaled. The night pressed its cool hand against his face. From a room behind him came a small clatter. Hephaestus laying a tool down, or Hermes dropping a coin, or Athena setting a law where it would be found in the morning. The kind of noise that means a home is occupied. He didn't sleep, he rarely did, but he went inside and sat where the net hung like a constellated warning, and let his eyes adjust until threads looked like lines on a palm, and for a second, just a long, private second, he believed in a future where thunder retires and children don't have to earn their fathers. Then the second ended. He was who he was, they were who they were, and the story, which has never learned to go quietly, turned the page. Every dynasty believes it's permanent until the lights flicker in a way only the tenants notice. Mini-hook fear keeps the crown on. It just never keeps the room warm. Zeus understood that better now, not because he'd grown kind, but because he'd learned arithmetic. A rain that runs on terror spends itself. People obey. They don't invest. Temples rise higher. Prayers get shorter. He could feel it in the petition lines: more incense. Less eye contact devotion measured like rent. So he did what survivors do: he adjusted the temperature without changing the furnace. News travelled of a city arguing with itself, athletes painting their bodies for spectacle, judges selling verdicts, poets auditioning for power, a clever man collecting followers by promising a gentler thunder. The rumour was soft as dust at first. Then it found a drum. One evening, a procession climbed Olympus with none of the usual props: no cattle, no carved cups, just a delegation of exhausted faces. They didn't ask for a miracle. They asked for a margin. Give us fewer omens and more time, the elder said, voice like rope. We can fix what we broke if the sky stops shouting. Silence did more work in that chamber than thunder ever had. Hera cut a look across the room that said, don't gloat. Athena held very still because stillness makes truth louder. Apollo tuned one string. Zeus stared at the net overhead, at the artifact of a day he would not forget, and understood the riddle inside power: the moment you're strong enough to stop proving it is the only proof anyone trusts. He nodded once. No speech. No performance. For a season, storms detoured the city. For a season, harvest chose mercy. The city didn't turn holy. It turned competent. Streets cleaned. Trials held. A school opened that taught memory like a song you pass from hand to hand. When the rains returned on schedule, people looked up and bowed, not because they were afraid, but because they knew the agreement had held. Respect is quieter than fear and takes longer to cook, but it feeds more people. You could call this a softening. It wasn't, it was policy. Zeus had learned the trick tyrants learn before they get statues toppled on their heads. Fear in public, favours in private, and just enough predictability to keep rebellion from penciling itself into the calendar. He was not Nero with a fiddle, not a generalissimo yelling at history. He was the prototype they all keep trying to imitate order first, Mercy measured. Consequences delivered with a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Archetype tyrant. Yes, but the kind that lasts. The kind that becomes a syllabus. Rulers centuries later would try on his stance and discover the same lesson spectacle wins you a week. Systems win you a lifetime. And yet, the old ache stayed. He would stand on the terrace counting lamplights and hear the cave of his childhood echo clash of shields. The goat's warm breath, his mother's hand steadying a world that wasn't. He was never Kronos. He knew that. But some nights he could feel his father's shadow testing the doors, asking whether he'd traded one hunger for another. He would put his palm to the rail and remind himself that love is unreliable. Fear is efficient, and respect, when it shows up, must be bribed with good weather. Then a small thing happened that cracked something larger. A boy at a country altar forgot the right words, panicked, and said, "I don't know the prayer, but thank you anyway for the breeze." That was it. No poetry, no listing of epithets. A breeze tilted the boy's hair and went on its way. Zeus felt it reach the mountain, and for reasons he wouldn't explain to anyone, didn't correct it. He let gratitude skip the paperwork. Climax doesn't always arrive as a monster. Sometimes it's a rule you choose not to enforce. The brothers met more often after that, Poseidon leaning his trident like a man leaning a rake. Hades arriving with ledger pages that smelled like pomegranate skin. They talked weather patterns the way fathers talk bedtimes, what is strict, what slides, what never slides. You can keep the sea on a short leash, Poseidon told him, but it bites its own tongue when you pull too hard. Hades said nothing for a long time, then said, "They come to me less angry when they've had time to say goodbye." None of them said the word compassion. Olympians use different nouns, tide, schedule, custom. But the adjustment was their law with room in it. Cases still came. Sisyphus kept pushing. Prometheus kept bleeding. Ares kept loving the crash more than the cause. Dionysus kept offering release to towns that forgot how to breathe. Athena kept writing rules that didn't care who was in the room. Hera kept being the weather system no forecast predicted. Zeus kept deciding some days gentler, some days like a door slamming 2 rooms away. He never abdicated. He edited. And the world, being the world, turned what it felt into myth. In kitchens. Mothers told children the net story in whispers the time the sky sat down and listened. On docks. Men swore by Etna's smoke and meant we know what heat does to pride. In schools, teachers traced a triangle on wax fear, favour, fairness, and asked which 2 a city could live on without choking. Someone always picked the wrong 2. Someone always learned. That's how legacy works, less thunder than curriculum. It would be cute to pretend Zeus finally wanted love. He wanted continuity. But continuity leaves footprints that look a lot like care. He stopped hanging offenders publicly when a private correction would do. He sent Hermes with jokes to rooms that were about to break. He let Hestia's quiet matter more. He took fewer bows. He took more walks. He listened to Athena when she said, "Not this law, not like that." He even touched the net less, as if memory didn't need a talisman. Under Etna, Typhon turned in his sleep, and the ground reminded everyone that peace is a rented room, renewed monthly. At the end, and there's always an end even for the ones who don't die the way mortals do, the shape of him changed more than the man. Statues chipped, eagles aged, oaths refreshed or didn't. The archetype remained a weather pattern in a chair, a boss the world never fired, a case study in power that learned not to shout every minute to stay heard. Kings studied him and either missed the point or swallowed it. Citizens lived under him and either hardened or learned the slow art of asking for margins. Children looked up at storms and learned 2 languages at once, fear and thanks. What remains, not the bolts, not the quotas of incense. Stories remain, and the habits they teach. A woman at a market, putting 1 apple back so the widow behind her will have one that isn't bruised, that's Athena's rule surviving without the badge. A fisherman who reads the tide and decides to wait a day, that's Poseidon's better lesson. A judge who writes the hard decision and then goes home and weeps where no one can see, that's Hades, tidy and tender. A festival that lets everyone be ridiculous for a night so the mornings don't turn murderous, that's Dionysus, grown responsible. A hearth that stays lit after the guests go because someone thought to stack dry kindling, that's Hestia, the god we keep by doing the work. And the sky, The sky remembers its volume control. As for Zeus, picture him the way he prefers to be remembered at the end of a bedtime story, not raging, not leering, watching, a hand on the rail, a storm he could call, choosing not to, the net above the table gathering dust and meaning, the mountain breathing like a sleeper who has finally found a position that doesn't ache, a breeze crossing a field because a boy once said thank you without the right words. Thunder fades, memory lingers, power learns its own weight or it breaks the furniture. Tonight, we set it down. We let the lamps hold the dark. We let the gods mind their business while we mind ours, bread rising, dogs sighing, someone in the next room turning a page. Breathe in, let it go. The stories will be here in the morning, and the sky, for once, understands the assignment.